This lecture is on the topic titled The Public Sphere, and the focus question here is, what concepts and institutions dominated colonial politics in the 18th century? In some ways, politics in 18th century colonial America seemed more democratic than in Britain. As in Britain, property ownership was a qualification for voting, ensuring that men with an economic stake in society and the independence of judgment that came with property determined government policies. Dependents who lacked their own will, such as slaves, servants, adult sons living in their parents' homes, the poor, and women, were all ineligible to vote. But the wide distribution of land ownership in America meant that a far higher percentage of the population had the right to vote compared to Europe, an estimated 50 to 80% of adult white men in colonial America as opposed to less than 5% in Britain. In some colonies, free blacks with property could vote. Some colonies also denied the vote to religious minorities such as Jews, Catholics, and dissenting Protestants, while everywhere Indians were generally prohibited from voting. But in colonial America, the people existed only on election day. Competitive elections were rare, and those who voted usually deferred to their social betters in their community who expected voters to support them because of their patronage, reputation, or social status. Real power resided in officials who were appointed, not elected. Governors and councils were appointed by the crown or proprietors everywhere except Rhode Island and Connecticut, where they were elected. In some colonies, such as South Carolina, the property qualification for holding office was far higher than that for the franchise, ensuring that only the wealthy could be elected. Few ordinary Americans pursued elective office or were active in public affairs. An ingrained tradition of deference, the assumption among ordinary people that wealth, education, and social prominence carried a right to public office, limited choices in elections, and often meant leadership roles went to the wealthiest landowners, frequently in a generational cycle within the same families. Concerned with events in Europe and imperial rivalries, British governments in the first half of the 18th century followed a policy of salutary neglect, allowing the American colonies to mostly govern themselves. This, in effect, gave large landowners, merchants, and lawyers more power to control local colonial politics, while elected representatives in colonial assemblies believed they represented the popular will and used their power over colonial finance and taxes to influence policy and appointed officials. In the 18th century, as economic development increased the power of American elites, colonial assemblies became more assertive and insisted that they controlled local affairs in the colonies as much as the House of Commons did in Britain. The most successful governors accommodated the ascendant assemblies and used patronage, such as land grants, to win support. Eliminating the governor's council, Pennsylvania's legislature was most powerful, but New York, Virginia, South Carolina, and especially Massachusetts also had powerful assemblies. Colonial representatives invoked liberal and Republican notions of liberty in making their claims on colonial and imperial officials. This language gradually reached beyond the political nation, dominated by a wealthy and educated American gentry. Particularly in colonial towns and cities, the public sphere expanded. The public sphere was the space in which political organization and debate independent of the government took place, in which an informed citizenry openly discussed questions previously addressed only by officials. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, clubs emerged that debated literary, philosophical, scientific, and political issues. The best known was the Junto, founded by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1727, a club that later became the American Philosophical Society. Compared to other European colonies in the Western Hemisphere, British North America had a very literate population and a vibrant press. Newspapers and circulating libraries were especially important in spreading information and ideas and expanding the public sphere, and by the 1730s, political commentary was prevalent in American newspapers. The best edited newspaper was probably Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, founded in 1728, which at its peak had a readership of 2,000. But if America had a vibrant press, free expression and free speech were not the norm in America, and not a traditional right for ordinary Britons. Freedom of speech had developed in Britain in the 1500s as a right for legislators and Parliament, as a means for facilitating representation. Outside of Parliament, free speech had no legal protection. Governments in Britain and the colonies viewed freedom of the press as quite dangerous. Until 1695, it was impossible to print a newspaper, book, or pamphlet without government permission. After this, the government could censor print matter only after it had been published. Editors of colonial newspapers that criticized officials or legislators were frequently punished, leading some Americans to call for a freedom of the press, which was not very often observed. The most famous court case in the colonies regarding freedom of the press showed that most colonists opposed prosecutions for criticizing public officials. In 1735, the German-born printer John Peter Zenger, who accused New York's governor of corruption, was arrested for seditious libel. His lawyer, Alexander Hamilton, asked the jury to judge the accuracy of Zenger's statements, not whether he printed them, and he was found not guilty. While libel remained a crime, the trial's outcome spread in the colonies the belief that newspapers should be allowed to print the truth without fear of punishment, and helped popularize the idea of free expression. In the 18th century, many educated Americans began to be influenced by the European Enlightenment, a philosophical movement with origins in France, which sought to apply to political and social life the scientific method of investigation and experimentation. Enlightenment thinkers demanded that every human institution, authority, and tradition be judged by the measure of reason. Benjamin Franklin, who established a newspaper, debating club, and library, published Poor Richard's Almanac, and conducted experiments that showed that lightning is electricity, embodied the spirit of Enlightenment. Critical of the religious wars that had engulfed Europe, Enlightenment thinkers hoped that reason, not religious enthusiasm, would rule human affairs. These philosophers, being skeptical of all traditions and authorities, easily criticized established churches. Many prominent Americans embraced Arminianism, which taught that reason alone could form the basis of religion, or deism, a belief that God had withdrawn from the world after creating it, leaving it to function according to natural scientific laws without divine intervention. In the 1600s, the English scientist Isaac Newton had discovered and demonstrated the natural laws that governed the universe. While many Protestants affirmed Newton's findings, arguing that it was evidence of God's work and maintaining their piety, deists believed that the best form of religious devotion was to study nature, not worship in organized churches. Prominent American deists in the late colonial era included Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson.